back to Ether Hour, everybody. I'm your host, Conrad Franz, joined as always by Dmitry Kalyagin, joined by a returning guest, a very special guest, somebody that we enjoy talking to very much about the topic of Russia and Orthodoxy and geopolitics around the world and World War III in general and all the things that we generally enjoy talking about here on Ether Hour and World War Now. That is Andrey Afanasyev. He is a Spas TV host as well as a war correspondent in Russia, a traditional Orthodox Christian. He is actually hosting a show that is forthcoming on the Spas TV network that I appeared on. If you follow us on social media, you saw the trailer for that show, Russian Ark, with my brief appearance featured in the trailers. So it's great to have him here with us. Andrey, how are you doing?
Hello, everyone. I'm so glad to be with you and to hear voices.
Excellent, Andrey. So I suppose just to start, many of our listeners and followers have been, of course, watching your trailers and some of the things you've been posting on Telegram, but most importantly, this Russian Ark project. And we understand it hasn't launched yet, but the trailer has been very promising. There's probably going to be a lot of very positive and constructive interviews coming from that show on Spas TV. Now, could you give us just some insight into this Russian Ark project? You know, yourself together with Lika Karetkina as well as Ivan Kupryanov have started this major project based in Moscow, essentially describing Westerners as well as people from overseas moving actually to Russia and finding a new spark, a new sort of patriotic life in Russia today as a sort of project, like giving Russia a new sort of vision as in of what Western people can expect if they do move to this very special place. And I think giving a very Christian perspective on Russia today to Western audiences, which is very important because, again, Russia has been slandered across Hollywood and international media for, you could say, I would say since the Cold War, but even before the revolution. So if you can maybe speak to us a little bit about this Spas TV Russian Ark project, Andrei, that would be very interesting.
I'm really happy that we managed to do first steps in this project. It's a very big beginning for me because I was dreaming of it for many years. I saw, as a part of a global social media community, I saw how year by year the popularity of traditional Orthodoxy, predominantly Russian Orthodoxy, is growing worldwide without any help from local governments and administrations, without, of course, any help from big social media platforms. Thousands and dozens of thousands of people every year were joining the Orthodox Church all over the world, mainly in the United States, but also in Europe, Australia, Latin America, everywhere. And my friends, my colleagues, and myself, we were talking about this, that there are a lot of people who are looking for content in English about Orthodoxy and also about the Orthodox perspective of what's happening in the world. And that's something we've been doing at Spas for a long time. Spas as a project was launched in the first decade of 21st century. And then when Boris Korchevnikov, the current CEO and editor-in-chief and general producer, he came to this project in 2017. He contributed a lot in refurbishing it and making it more modern and fast and reacting and interactive. And our audience in Russia grew a lot since this time, 7 years already, actually a lot. And we understood that we have this warehouse of information, warehouse of knowledge, of positions, of experience that we could share. It doesn't mean that everyone should immediately join us and think and feel and live like we do, but Russian Orthodox perspective is something that is not still widespread in the West, and it has the answers to questions almost every white Christian or ex-Christian has now. And there is also a very deep part of it because there are a lot of prophecies that in the end of this world's history, Russia will be the last resort for Christians all over the world. We all know from Apocalypse that eventually Antichrist will get control over this world. But some prophecies in Orthodox Church, in Russian Orthodox Church, say that if Russian Church, are humble enough and we live according to the scripture, Russia will be saved by God and there will be no control over Russia till the very end of the days, until the second coming. And it will be the place where Christians still will be able to live according to the scripture, to the Bible, to the gospel. And Russia's mission is to get all the people on it as an ark of salvation, like Noah did in the Old Testament. So that's why Russia is so big. That's why Russia is so wealthy. That's why God gave us such a big land. Because in the end of the history, we're supposed to share with this land with all the Christians, with all our brothers and sisters all over the world who do not want to bow to the Antichrist. That is probably coming, and well, actually, he's always coming. We know this since the very first days of our church, that there are prophecies, and it is well said that we are living in the end of the days, the last days. So our day should be like the last one. So this is the main point. We, on the one hand, want to say our word in this today's world that is not perfect from the point of view of freedom of speech, of course, but we want to do this especially on independent and semi-independent platforms, so to say. And also we want to tell the people that we understand that the peoples of the West are not responsible for what's happening in Ukraine, what was happening in Russia in the 90s, and that we are really welcoming to all of the Christians that want to come and live here according to gospel. And you know that recently Vladimir Putin signed this decree, actually, that allows to get the first stage of residence permit for citizens from Western countries, Europe, United States, Australia, New Zealand, on the base of values. Actually, that's a revolution in our migration policy. It's something that we wouldn't expect from our post-Soviet government. And when it's happened, I was really shocked and surprised in a good way.
When that first happened, a lot of people in our audience were immediately asking us about it. It was something that caught a lot of people's attention. And, I've been to Russia twice recently, and I know people there, Father Joseph Gleason, Tim Kirby, other people that have been involved in the, move to Russia movement, as it were, for Orthodox people, traditional Christians to relocate to, to the third Rome, to the vast land of Rus. And I think you're right, Andrey. I think there's a good chance that the reason God gave such a vast land to Russia was for this very reason. I mean, we know about the prophecies of St. Seraphim of Sarov to, the nuns of Divyevo about how the Antichrist would not rule past the trench that is at his monastery. There are many other prophecies about this, of course. I was just on Mount Athos, and many monks are talking about this as well, talking about Russia, people moving to Russia, the place of the Russian military and the future Russian Empire, perhaps in the eventual things to come as World War III continues to unfold. Of course, we here at World War Now believe we are already very much in the midst of World War III. But before we start talking about some of those things, specifically what's going on in Ukraine and Russia, as well as the Middle East and how those two things interact, Andrey, where can people eventually watch this new show when it comes out? And what is your plan for sort of connecting to the Western audience? Because it is in the English language, of course. So I think it's going to be something that a lot of people are going to want to tune into.
Well, we count a lot on independent bloggers in Western Hemisphere because we understand that our show is not something that will be welcomed on most platforms. But I see and I know, and you guys are one of the reasons why we are doing this, that there are people who would welcome us and who would be ready to share our content and would be ready to get involved in our projects and discussions and interviews. This is something that we really want. We will concentrate mainly on spiritual side, but in today's world, religion and spiritual side is pure politics.
Yeah, absolutely. I think we've seen religion both exploited as well as attacked in Western countries over the last few decades. We've seen, for example, Protestant evangelicalism used to garner support for Israel, which is viewed today in American foreign policy as a major asset. And we've seen religion, of course, attacked in the Ukraine as it's viewed as a sort of branch of the Russian world, when in fact, Orthodox Christianity in Ukraine, as as our listeners know very well, is in fact the gem of Ukraine. It's the diamond under the earth. It's one of the only valuable things I think Ukraine has always had and has had ever since the Polish occupation, even the Tatar-Mongol yoke. It's something that those Ukrainian Malorossian, Novorossian lands have always had sort of in common with Rus and the rest of the Orthodox world, the Orthodox faith. And this is exactly what it appears that Zelensky and his government are attempting to essentially shut down. And in fact, since we last spoke, Andrei, the persecution of the Orthodox Church in Ukraine has actually picked up speed, and they've actually passed that law in the Verkhovna Rada, the Ukrainian parliament, and they have moved. They've been developing their persecution, making it more streamlined. We've been seeing Jan Taksur, the Ukrainian Orthodox journalist, he's been posting a lot about this, and a lot of Orthodox journalists have been reporting on the fact that Orthodox priests in Ukraine have been getting actually taken to, essentially kidnapped, lynched, conscripted forcefully, taken away from their families, away from their bishops, and forced to enroll and become essentially conscripts drafted into the Ukrainian military, which we know for Orthodox priests, it's possible to be a military chaplain, but not to actually hold weapons and spill blood and murder, kill others in the field of battle. And this is very obviously the Ukrainian government knows these old church canons, and yet it still pushes to destroy the church through various means. Of course, you've been following the persecution very closely, but it seems that the persecution in Ukraine is picking up pace. It's almost like a demonic desperation that we're seeing from Zelensky, his government, and of course his NATO handlers who have been active in Kiev and in other Western European countries, unfortunately, ruling everything top down. Is that the same view that you have from your position being in the SMO zone and traveling and speaking to other military journalists and correspondents?
Well, I can tell you, and once again tell you, that this war is a religious war, and it is clearly seen by majority of our troops, of our guys fighting there in the SMO zone. It's something that I pay a lot of attention to as a journalist. And you know that we are living in the age of new martyrdom. And when we liberate the Malorossia, we will discover the new martyrs that are now being killed, as you said, executed and martyred in the territory controlled by Kiev. One important note, the priests of canonical Orthodox Church, the only one that can be in Ukraine, that is Ukrainian Orthodox Church of Moscow's Patriarchate, cannot be chaplains in a military, in Ukrainian military. To be a chaplain, one should join the schismatic PTSU, this Orthodox Church of Ukraine created by Bartholomew. And this is something that indicates a lot. It shows that on the official level of army, there is no place for the canonical priest. The army can be led only by those priests who are, so to say, loyal to the regime and who are loyal to the Western agenda. Unfortunately, a lot of representatives of Western Christian denomination, Greek Catholics, Protestants, played a huge role in Maidan in 2014 and are still playing this role in Ukrainian elites. And people who share traditional Orthodox values are being persecuted or at least marginalized in the society. And this society was authentically from the very beginning Orthodox. So what we see is a fight for whether these lands and these people will have the chance to stay Orthodox, to stay with God in Orthodox Church, or they will join the Western post-Christian civilization, so to say. You know that Ukraine was the first and probably the only post-Soviet country to legalize the Church of Satan as official religious institution on its territory. It was in 2012 or 13, just before Maidan. And that's it.
I think the situation in Ukraine has been something that in America we know. It was Father Seraphim, wasn't said by Father Seraphim, but Father Seraphim Rose translated the book. I believe it's Russia's Catacomb Saints. At the beginning it says, what started in Russia will come to America regarding, the Soviet persecution of the church. And we're seeing what's happening in Ukraine right now. And we're seeing that our government supported that. And we have Mike Pompeo openly talking about how he's proud to have supported the creation of the schismatic church. And we realize if they're willing to do that over there in Ukraine, they're more than willing to do all of those things to the American people as well. And we've had Father John Whiteford on the show before to talk about, how we already know that the U.S. government is keeping its eye on the Orthodox churches in America and that they are very much making it clear that they could eventually view us as some kind of Russian agent, just the exact same thing they're doing in Ukraine when people are, of course, just trying to worship in the way of the gospel and the Orthodox way. But I think the situation in Ukraine has made a lot of people realize how in a supposedly liberal first world country supported by all of the mainstream institutions, they can and will martyr you for the true faith. So that's something that has awakened a lot of people and has even made a lot of people consider wanting to move to Russia, like we've talked about. And we hope that that topic will be explored more on the Russian ARC program. But specifically talking about Ukraine, Andrey, you yourself are, of course, a war correspondent. I want to get the latest update. What is going on? Of course, we know since we last talked, the whole Kursk debacle has unfolded. I want to get your thoughts on how that is developing, as well as the other latest updates from the front lines like Ugledar and some of these other towns that have fallen. We know that the more towns in Ukraine that are able to be liberated, the more, the persecution can be stopped, of course. We hope that more and more places can be freed from the yoke of, I believe you've mentioned this is a religious conflict. I believe that the Russian military and the state should be leaning even more into the, that is the main reason for them to be here, because you're right, the more territory they take, the less people that are going to be subject to this horrible persecution. So I would love to hear your thoughts on, the latest from the front line and, what you think the latest moves are. And I'm reading here some from latest comments from Lavrov. I don't know if you're seeing these. I don't want to distract you or make any breaking news here on the show, but I'm wondering your thoughts on how, the current front line is going to go as perhaps negotiations are becoming more and more likely.
Well, we must understand that the main part of the front line is the so-called the Donetsk direction. It's where the main strategic and tactical operations are taking place. The Kursk operation from the Ukrainian side was considered to drive our chief staff's attention to this region because the Ugledar was about to fall, New York fell, and the things are getting worse and worse for Ukrainian military in Donetsk territory, the next direction. And once we finish this, everything can fall for them. It is just because of the landscape of the territory. It is hill. In Donetsk, there are a lot of hills that let you to organize the defense the correct way. I don't remember whether I told you last time that the Ukrainian fortresses resemble the structural fortresses of Nazi Germany back in 1943. After they lost Stalingrad, they retreated to this very part of Soviet Union because the landscape was letting them to create a chain of fortresses strong enough to withstand a huge offensive. And it was called the Ostwall, the East Wall. And if we look at the map of Ukrainian fortresses that were built and rebuilt since 2014 with the help of American economy and a lot of resources, we can see that they almost the same. When I was in Avdiivka, I talked to guys that were liberating it, our military, and they said that they heard the planes, the American military planes, coming to this area almost every day, bringing construction workers, specialists, some resources, and that's why Avdiivka was so well equipped. It was a real fortress, I can tell you. And every city that is being liberated by our forces is not just another city as we imagine it, another Eastern European city as a Western imagine it. It's a chain of fortresses, chain of communications, catacombs, minefields, and it's really tough, but we are doing this. And everyone must understand that our enemy is ourselves. And fighting against Russians is the worst thing you can you can imagine. Believe me, Russians are the worst enemy we ever had. So that's absolute truth. And we are liberating Kursk region every day. Ukrainian side lost about 20,000 people already. How many people did America lose in Vietnam? 40 to 60. So it means that Ukraine lost half of all the Vietnam losses of United States just in Kursk region in 3 months. Can you imagine this? Soviet Union lost about 12 or 15,000 in Afghanistan in 10 years. They just pushing all the brigades that are still capable to fight there, because from the very beginning, the Ukrainian side was acting not from the point of view of rationality and military success, but from the point of view of informational and political success of groups in the West that control them. And of course, the Kursk operation is nothing but a psyop. It doesn't have any strategic or even tactical sense, but it has, of course, a lot of psychological and informational sense that affected both the world, the West, and our society, and Ukrainian society, everything. But in general, the strategic losses in Donetsk part of the front line cannot be covered by a PSYOP operation in Kursk. They won several months more before they fall in the collapse of a coup in Ukraine. I believe that more and more people in Ukraine will start the war against their own government, understanding that the leadership of Ukraine does nothing but destroying and actually committing genocide in the territory of Ukraine, killing as more men ready to fight and have children as possible. And well, the only way for Ukrainian military to stay alive is to fight against their government. Otherwise, they would be killed by our troops or by the police regiments in the territory of Ukraine, because there are a lot of forces, a lot of brigades are deployed in the center of the country just in order to control the possible riots.
I think it's very important when you mention that the Kursk operation, which commenced, I believe, the 6th of August and onwards since, has essentially been a psychological operation, both in order to boost the morale of the Ukrainians themselves, to show that, wow, look, we can take so many square kilometers of territory. We're actually doing okay. We're not losing all of our key fortress cities in the Donetsk Oblast and these other places on the Eastern Front. Look, we are doing fine, right? We're trading. That's the illusion that they tried to sort of portray here, right? Attacking a lot of civilian targets. And this is where Alexei Dumin comes in, somebody who President Putin actually promoted to quite a senior position in the Russian government, and now has appointed Alexei Dumin specifically to the Kursk Oblast to handle what's called a KTO, counter-terrorist operation, as you probably know. And it's very, I think, a good experience. And it's good that people like Alexei Dumin, I think, Andrey, you'd probably agree, they have at least some time to show how well of a manager they are, both militarily and in terms of civilian prowess, because Russia at the moment does need these uplifting sort of heroes in the government, so to speak, faces like heroic figures who can command authority and show that they have been successful as well on the front lines, which is very interesting. And the reason I think why it was announced to be a counter-terrorist operation and not, say, another front of the SMOs, because of that civilian targeting by the Ukrainians. We've been following your work as well as other war correspondents from Russia, and just the targeting of Russian farms, Russian farmlands in the Kurskaya region, civilian targets, killing animals, people, harassing, deporting, imprisoning of just civilians, bringing them essentially almost like the Tatar-Mongol yoke. The Ukrainians would come in and then they would take people into POW camps, prisoner of war camps, the harassment of civilians in the Kursk Oblast. It's very reminiscent of an actual, what the terrorists of, say, the first and the second Chechen campaigns would do when they would invade Dagestan, for example. Very similar, sort of harassing, aiming for the civilians to demoralize the local population and to cause confusion in the Russian media as well, because how do you report on this event without falling into despair? So it poses a challenge to the opponents. And I think if you can comment on just on that particular facet of terrorism, like we've seen the RDKs and some of the other terrorist organizations in Ukraine, their activities in Bryansk, Belgorod, Kursk, it seems to be just a demoralization tactic used by Ukraine strategy-wise to actually attack the native Russian population in these very, very Orthodox, like Belgorod, Kursk, for example, Belgorod, these are 95% Orthodox Christian, very, very Christian regions. And we see drones smashing into churches, into civilian apartments, Ukrainian drones, of course. People are suffering greatly. And it puts a lot of pressure, again, on the Russian government in terms of their military on those front lines to actually defend the civilians. So it does seem like Ukraine is not afraid of actually hitting civilian targets, which is one thing we haven't seen Russia doing, is conducting these demoralization tactics and strategies. And that's a big difference in how this war is even conducted. If you can comment on that sort of KTO that's taking place now.
Well, the way it is happening, I mean, the offensive of Ukraine and this terror attacks they are committing clearly shows that all of this was planned by people who live abroad Russia and don't know our mentality. They don't understand that such actions in Russia and against Russians, they work the different way, not like on the majority of societies worldwide. I don't want to say something bad about other nations, but we all know who won the World War II and how other European nations were acting when they faced Hitler. So that's a clear indication that this operation was organized by people with Western mentality. But I can tell you that Kursk is now one of the most organized and well-coordinated regions in Russia because all the people, all the civilians there are feeling really mobilized. They are the patriotism rate, if we can say like this, is very high there. And actually, this operation, of course, brought suffering, stress to our society. But on the other hand, it gave us the new impulse. And actually, it helped. It helped to remobilize the society. And a lot of people, a lot of volunteers, a lot of my friends, myself, a lot of people went there to cover, to help, to see the military condition. And, well, I'm sure that everything will be fine. There will be no Ukrainian occupation soon there. But God lets everything happen for a reason. And we will probably, afterwards, we will understand why it happened like this, why God let this happen, and we will understand everything. What is clear is that the regime in Ukraine has months now, not even years. And a lot of course, depends on the elections in the United States, as you know, the global metropolis. But no matter what results will be in the United States, Ukraine won't last long, to my point of view.
I definitely agree. I think Ukraine, as we understand it, is very much young for this world. But I think to look at the broader perspective of the overall world war going on, of which Ukraine is one of the primary fronts, we call it the Northern Front. Then there's the Southern Front, everything going on in the Levant in the Middle East. We're hearing all about, of course, the current Israeli ground invasion of Lebanon. We recently witnessed Iranian strikes on Israel, the biggest strike in history on Israel by Iran of any such nature. And of course, we have seen and been covering the Russian flights landing in Tehran, landing in Iran, supposedly supplying Iran with S-400 air defense, other weapons and things like this. I'm wondering, Andrey, your perspective again as somebody that covers war and conflict and understands these things. We see Iran and Syria, two allies of Russia that are facing direct strikes and attack and assault from Israel at the current stage under this war. We, of course, have a lot of Russian citizens in a lot of these countries being tied up in all of this. I'm wondering your thoughts as well on how the conflict in Ukraine is going to tie into this. So, of course, your perspective on the conflict as a whole, but specifically as well how, as things perhaps ramp up in the Middle East between Israel, Hezbollah, Iran, the broader axis of resistance, and then, of course, inevitably bringing in the United States. I'm wondering how will this affect, of course, the course of the Ukraine offensive as, the West sort of gets more stretched thin as more of these conflicts break out. What do you think how much of an effect do you think this will have? And how will Russia respond to some of its allies potentially getting more and more dragged into this war as they are still fighting, of course, in Ukraine?
Well, recently, one of prominent priests here in Russia called Father Andrey Afanasyev posted a wonderful text in Russian on the conflict in the Middle East, indicating that it is purely biblical. And it shows that everything in the world is described by the Bible, by the scripture, saying that Israel is fighting the ancient nations of the Middle East. There are new nations that don't have long history. The Arab Emirates, Saudi Arabia, all of the Gulf states, they don't have 1,000 years heritage. Israel has, on the one hand, not this today's formation, the state, but they claim to have the relation to the Old Testament. Iran has as the Persian Empire. Syria has as also a very old nation. And it shows that two main enemies in the Middle East, today's Israel and today's Iran, they open the biblical perspective because both of the nations are biblical. And nations that are not biblical are not directly involved in this conflict in the Middle East, or they're just looking for the result. And it's also very deep. It's not something that is on the surface, but it gives explanation. On the other hand, what we see is, of course, very, so to say, it gives me the understanding that we are probably more and more close to the last days, probably, because Israel is one of the main objectives for them is rebuilding the third temple. And we know that according to Christian and Muslim eschatology, the Antichrist will be reigning in the third temple. And it clearly indicates that the world, once again, is very close to this point. It doesn't necessarily mean that it will happen. It could happen many times in the world's history. But in certain periods, humanity, Christendom, passes a certain exam. And if we don't pass this time, probably everything will finish. And well, soon we will know what the results of the test, the results of the exam. Do we pass it or don't? If everyone will be just looking in an idle way to what's happening in Ukraine, in the Middle East, probably this weakness will give the evil spirits the opportunity to come and reign this world. If we do something actively, if we fight for the right thing the way we can, or at least if we pray and if we humble ourselves, probably the world would be spared for some more time. And this is my perspective. The Middle Eastern conflict is clearly biblical and it's eschatological, just like the war in Novorossiya, Donbass, and ex-Ukraine, because it is eschatological for us, for Russians. There were prophecies that are coming true. And these prophecies were laughed at by a lot of people. And now no one is laughing. And for us, the war in Ukraine is the war between two Russias. Russia that wants to be Orthodox, wants to be with Christ, with tradition, and Russia that wants to be with Antichrist. I can say that the war in Ukraine is the rehearsal of the last battle of Armageddon, because we are brothers. We have same faces, names, surnames, and we fight each other for a religious reason, eschatological reason. This is what eventually will happen in the last battle of humanity, in which all the humanity will be involved in this or that way.
No, completely agree. There's definitely the things taking place in the Middle East are very telling, especially to somebody who's been in the church for a long time. I think everyone's been aware of some of the prophecies said, as well as what will take place, from the book of Revelations and church tradition. It's very clear as to what role, not even this modern state of Israel, but the future state of, I suppose, Israel, whatever it will be called under the regime of the Antichrist, what role that will play in world history. I think it's very telling. What my perspective, Andrey, would be very interesting to find out. Have you been hearing much from any, because we know Russian military personnel are stationed in Syria at the moment. We know Russia has between 10 and 20 smaller bases around Syria at the moment. And it seems that it's quite a precarious situation because Israel essentially is waging a war, as you said, very biblical war, almost in Lebanon. It's almost like it takes you back to the Old Testament when wars would be waged on this territory thousands of years ago now. And you have Israel flying F-15s, F-16s, F-17s, F-35s, American planes, the same ones which the United States is also giving to, as you said, the sort of antichrist version of Russia, which they constructed in the Ukraine, this regime. These same planes Israel is flying over, bombing Damascus, bombing some of these territories which still have Russian civilians and Russian citizens and even military personnel stationed. What would be your perspective on, because it seems very hard for Israel to do this without accidentally maybe even, there's a real risk of Israel actually harming Russian citizens in these particular places. And I note that Israel has taken, it seems, very extreme care not to touch the interests of the Russian Orthodox Church in Israel itself. So the Russian Orthodox Church outside of Russia, the real estate in Palestine, some of the monasteries, churches, cathedrals, and those, of course, under the Moscow Patriarchate as well in Jerusalem and some of these other places. It appears as if Israel is playing a very careful game, specifically against the Shia Muslims and some of the other groups, but trying not to offend Orthodox Christians, not to tilt Russia against it. Is that kind of maybe how you and other Russian war correspondents would see the situation? It seems that Netanyahu, besides the fact that he's very aggressive in his politics against Hamas, Hezbollah, and Iran, is very careful in how he deals with Russia, as well as Russian interests, even religious interests like the Russian church, real estate, and other holy places in the Middle East. There seems to be less pressure on Orthodox Christians and out of strategic considerations. So maybe you can comment on these two things, the military bases in Syria, or maybe is there any relation of Russia and Israel? Are those relations affected by this situation there?
Well, I don't have any clear information on what's happening in Syria, just because I dedicate all of my time and effort to the SMO zone. But I'm sure that it won't be something serious against us from Israel, at least at this point, because Russia, even though we have a lot of tough points, is in a good connection with Turkey there in the Middle East. And Turkey and Israel are also on the brink of a hot conflict, at least from the point of view of formulations of words said by main political leaders like Erdogan. And of course, they want to balance Russia so that Russia does not take any of the sides of the conflict. So I don't really think, and I don't know whether there is going to be some kind of a big provocation against Russian troops in Syria. But I can tell you that I've been to Israel as an Orthodox Christian, and I was treated there as a person of a second sort, second class. I felt it, and I didn't enjoy it. I was there as a pilgrim to the Holy Tomb, and I really felt that Christians in this country are not, first-class citizens, of course. And it can be felt on every Easter, on how everything is organized, how the police acts, how they treat the patriarch, how they look for lighters and matches in his dress, not believing that the holy fire comes on Orthodox Easter. It's an insult, actually. And of course, a lot of holy places in the territory of Israel are being desecrated by local radicals, the representatives of Judaic community. And obviously, the life there for Christians is probably not as bad as it could be, but we cannot say that it's perfect. And I don't think that it can get better just because the pace the state of Israel has got towards, constructing something militarized, aggressive, and verticalized. Sometimes you need to wait for a lot of time, or at least some time, to see the clear processes of what's happening. And we need to wait and see how the things will change in the Middle East and how everything will affect the conflict in SMO zone. Because we are now talking less than a month remaining till the elections in the America, meaning that, these elections will change a lot no matter what result will be, because a lot of processes, a lot of decisions are just being held till the elections. In the US administration, in Israel administration, in Russia's administration, everywhere. So what I strongly believe is that we are going to have a really hot November and December globally.
Thank you so much for listening to the free segment of this amazing Ether Hour. Get behind that paywall to listen to the rest of our conversation with Andrey. We talk about potential Lukashenko and Putin's successors, prophecies about Russia during World War III, during the Antichrist times. We talk about other things regarding the SMO, of course, the future borders of Russia, the future status of quote-unquote Ukraine at the end of all of this going on, and of course the Ukraine connection with the Southern Front down in the Levant, as well as a whole host of other issues going on in Russia. Some things that you're not going to hear anywhere else, frankly. So be sure to get behind the paywall, listen to the full conversation. Thank you again so much for listening. You who support us and get behind the paywall, you're the ones that make the show possible. So thank you so much again. God bless, and we will see you on the other side.